And then, given the dreary weather, let us, without delay, take you to the idyllic place shown on the PowerPoint presentation, the topic of this lecture. This extraordinary building, overviewing the breathtaking panorama of the Gulf of Naples, is the Casa Malaparte, the modernist villa commissioned and partially designed by the controversial novelist Curzio Malaparte. The building has become an architectural icon, a status that only increased by the fact that it was used as the film set for Jean-Luc Godard's classic Le Mépris, of which some stills are shown on the right. Its owner was as notorious as the building itself. Kurt Erich Suckert, who would later take the pseudonym Malaparte, was born in 1898 from an Italian mother and a German father. After the First World War, Malaparte was a fascist agitator and provocative journalist. After the Second World War, he had become an internationally acclaimed writer. His two great novels, Caput and La Pelle, The Skin, offer some of the most brilliant and humane literary descriptions of the atrocious consequences of war, and for most critics serve as convincing recantations of his formal political choices. In a passage from La Pelle, Malaparte recounts how Field Marshal Rommel, right before his decisive defeat at El Alamein, was a guest at Casa Malaparte. Although Malaparte indeed rubbed shoulders with the highest fascist officials, it is almost certain that this visit never took place. In the scene, Rommel asks Malaparte whether the house was already built when he bought it, or whether he had built it himself. I replied, and it was not true, so I quote Malaparte, I replied, and it was not true, that I had bought the house as it stood, and pointing with a sweeping gesture to the sheer cliffs of Matromania, the three gigantic rocks of the Faraglioni, the Sorrento Peninsula, the island of the Sirens, the distant blue of the Amalfi coastline and the remote golden glimmer of the Paestum shores, I said, I designed the scenery. This anecdote strikingly captures Malaparte. It illustrates his paradoxes, his lies, his charms, his sense of tragic beauty and surreal humor, his self-aggrandizement and self-mockery. He remains controversial, and even now some critics see him as an opportunist chameleon who used his literary talent to reinvent himself according to the needs of the moment. To get to know the real Malaparte, if there is such a thing, there is probably no better way than to study his house. He himself called it a ritratta di Pietro, a self-portrait in stone. Triste, dura, severa, he called it. Melancholy, hard, severe. A house like me. In this lecture, we will take Malaparte as a case study for modernism and its relation to temporality, to the past. Just like its owner, Casa Malaparte abounds with contradictions and ambiguities that, as we will argue, are meaningful for the era as a whole. Malaparte bought the domain and began the construction of the house around 1938. The 5 past years had been difficult ones. A dissident within the fascist movement, Malaparte had provoked Mussolini, among other things, by writing a pamphlet against Hitler and mocking Il Duce's awful taste in neckties. Finally, he was arrested and condemned to 5 years of imprisonment and exile on the barren island of Lipari. Thanks to powerful friends, he was released in the 3rd year. But ironically, the imprisonment had given him a taste for seclusion, and that is how the idea of building a house on the inaccessible cliffs of Capri came about. Building was actually forbidden in the area, but with the help of his contacts at the party top, he nevertheless got the permit. The plans for the house were originally designed by Adalberto Libera, one of the most representative architects of Italian modernism, but he seems to have abandoned the building process halfway, undoubtedly due to the incompatibility of his viewpoints with those of his flamboyant client. For Libera, as for most modern architects, form followed function. Malaparte, on the other hand, was much less interested in the practical aspects of the building than in the artistic dimension of the house. He wanted to create, and I quote, the most beautiful scenery in the world, unquote, a place dedicated to artistic creation and itself a monument to it. More and more, Malaparte himself had altered Libera's plans and would later claim the house to be completely his own artistic creation. Indeed, Malaparte had strong opinions on architecture. He wanted Casa Malaparte to be a manifesto house, the most modern house in Capri. In line with modernist aesthetics, this for him first of all meant that the traditional ornamentation taken from historical styles had to be abandoned. He wanted, and I quote, no little Romanesque columns, no arches, no ogival windows, none of those hybrid marriages between Moorish, Romanesque, Gothic and secessionist styles. In his political writings too, he spoke out against the pompous historical style of early fascist architecture. And I quote him, to express the revolutionary and imperial character of fascist Italy through archaeological reconstructions, triumphal arrangements of columns and capitals and pompous marble sepulchres would be absurd and ridiculous, unquote. The, and I quote, ultra-modern spirit and character of fascist Italy, unquote, required a radical breach with the past. And just as modernist architecture's innovative aesthetics had to reflect the revolutionary, transformative power of fascism, its severity and simplicity had to reflect its moral values. Strength, health, discipline, purity. Malapart called his house a place, in truth, only for strong men, for free spirits. But what makes Casa Malapart so interesting is that, like its owner, it abounds with contradictions, by which it refutes all easy ideological readings. First of all, let us look at its relation to the past, for there are lots of conflicting temporalities here as well. A closer glance will reveal that this ultra-modern building is by no means free from historical influences, on the contrary. To mention only the most fundamental ones, Libera's design was modelled after the typical Hellenistic domus, something which is clear from the elongated layout of the house, the rigidly symmetrical distribution of the rooms, and the central atrium as the nucleus of the house. Then there is the trademark of the house, the trapezoid staircase, a feature not included in Libera's original plan. The inspiration for the staircase came from a small church in Lipari, but other historical models as well immediately come to mind, especially within this scenery. It has often been said that the stairs repeat the shape of a Greek amphitheatre, an architectural form that also integrated the landscape into its function. And finally, the monumental stairs and the sunroof also bring to mind the sacral typologies of the ziggurat, the pyramid, and the antique temples with their outdoor altars. The staircase, the shape of which underlines the embeddedness of the architecture in the natural surroundings, indeed has undeniable sacral overtones. The atmosphere of antique religion is present inside the house too. Heat and vitality is what speaks from La Danza, the sculpture of Pericle Fazzini, that originally was the centerpiece of the atrium. Opposite to it is an impressively large fireplace around which Malapart's guests would gather. The hearth, as a symbol of the goddess Vesta, had a special place in Roman religion. Its fire represented the presence of the divine in everyday life. Malapart heightened its mystic aura by adding a special feature. Inside the wall, behind the stone hearth, a thick glass plate is installed, so that sea and sky can be perceived through the flames, a combination of all the elements. Of course, the allusions to antiquity are not as such surprising. The myth of ancient Rome, of antiquity as a timeless ideal, was as essential to the self-definition of Italian fascism. The glory that was Rome had to serve as a means to sacralize politics, to unite the masses and overcome the cultural disorder of fin de siècle culture. But Casa Malapart differs radically from fascist architecture because of another characteristic of Malapart's style, his ineradicable taste for surrealism, which by nature stands in opposition to the pompous seriousness of fascism. Casa Malapart is full of absurdist architectural gestures, and it is no coincidence that these individualistic quirks are especially to be found in the many references to the past. The most obvious example are the tables and benches in which fluted column drums originally supported huge cross-sections of tree trunks. One can hardly look at them as a reverent nod to antiquity. Rather, these column drums call in mind the melancholic paintings of the Chirico, in which antique building fragments lie side by side with equally out-of-place modern objects. De Chirico's desolate landscapes, lost in time, are populated only by uncanny mannequins who seem to suggest the loss of identity and authenticity of the modern subject, an alienation for which the remnants of the past obviously offer no cure. The picture is complete when we know that Malaparte even had 2 column sections hollowed out with the explicit purpose of using them as sanitary facilities, a toilet seat and a bidet. Looking back now to the mythical fireplace, we can see the influence of surrealism at work there too. The image he created was not only a mystical union of the elements, but also an absurdist upturning of their workings, comparable with, for example, the paintings of Magritte. You could see the sea burn. And an even more sublime instance in which he combines the anarchistic creativity of surrealism with the traditions of antiquity are the large windows with their breathtaking views of Capri's cliffs. Malaparte chose to surround them with a chestnut frame, which suggests they are moving, living paintings rather than windows. Talamona, in her excellent book on Malaparte, suggests a relation between these picture windows and the trompe-l'œil mural paintings found in the villas of Pompeii and Herculaneum. To us, this connection seems almost undeniable. But where the Pompeian frescoes tried to sell us a painting for a real view, Malaparte does the opposite, completely in line with the surrealist taste to blur the opposition between representation and reality. Looking at these wonderful framings, one can see the truth in Malaparte's immodest claim that he created the scenery. A final example is the outdoor stairs, leading to nowhere but the empty roof. What Malaparte does is to literally put upside down the concept of a fascist monumental staircase that by its shape alone suggests a pyramidal hierarchy. Malaparte's staircase, on the other hand, begins with a narrow base that gradually opens up as to prepare the visitor for the infinity of the horizon. In opposition to the monumental staircase, it leads not to the glorification of the ego, but to its immersion into the environment. On the roof itself, Malaparte has added one more surrealistic element, a curved white wall in the form of a sail. Le Corbusier may have modelled his unité d'habitation on the ocean liner, an icon of technological progress, but Malaparte seems to have chosen the more fragile image of a sailing boat, lying stranded on the cliff while water and wind whirl around it.
How now to read this ambiguous building and its relation to its historical models? Casa Malaparte's paradoxes are not insignificant. They reveal something about the paradoxes inherent to the modernist project itself, about the problematic breach with the past that is at the center of its self-definition. For an analysis of modernity's relation to the past, we now turn to another writer and cultural critic who some years earlier also had sought refuge on the island of Capri, the German scholar Walter Benjamin. It was during his stay there that he had met Asha Lakis, a Latvian theatre director and a radical communist. Benjamin described this encounter as a vital liberation. It would steer his thinking into a new direction. The text he wrote together with Asha during this period appear to have anticipated his magnum opus, the Arcades Project, a book of fragments, a strange mixture of historiography of modern urban life, Jewish mysticism, and Marxist philosophy. Benjamin too believed that in the 20th century a decisive breach was about to be made, that the world of 19th century capitalism was moving towards its end. But in the Arcades Project, it wasn't so much the idea of a new era that interested him, but rather the residues of the old one, the by that time outmoded arcades of the 19th century. Benjamin experienced and described them as mythical places, still evoking dream images that commemorated a myth of a prehistorical past of magical abundance. Another space he described as having the same dreamlike qualities is a bourgeois interior of the 19th century. It's also the kind of interior that Peter has discussed on the left. The abundant decoration and clutter typical for these interiors, for Benjamin represented the inhabitants' escapist longings, Surrounded by artifacts of distant times and exotic places, the bourgeois could blissfully forget the prosaic reality of the industrial capitalist system and the advent of a technocratic mass society. A series of shocks would eventually force him to awake. New technologies profoundly changed urban life. The First World War brought about the unknown devastation of modern warfare. Class struggle led to the Russian Revolution, and Dada proclaimed the bankruptcy of traditional Western culture. These violent ruptures brutally shattered the dream space of the 19th century interior. But this destruction also allowed to make a new start in architecture. For Benjamin, the radicalist modernity of Le Corbusier, on the right, seemed to herald this new interior, and I quote, "The work of Le Corbusier seems to arise when the house, as a mythological configuration, approaches its end." The new interior was to be a place from which to face the world as it was. Technology was no longer something to be feared or disguised, but became a source of inspiration, or, with the words of Le Corbusier, a libération from cursed enslavement to the past. Ultimately, modernism's ambition to be fully free of the past hides an even more ambitious dream, to be free of the passing of time itself. To abandon all styles and keep nothing but a functional essence would ideally mean to create something truly timeless, universal. Benjamin, however, better than anyone, understood that to completely step out of the stream of history was not only impossible, but even undesirable. He described the past as an imaginative force, a creative energy within modernism itself, and I quote Michael Mack, "The past survives in modernity in radically changed form, but at the same time it becomes itself a force that makes transformation possible insofar as it suspends the presumed understanding of the modern as a self-sufficient, autonomous project." In other words, past and present crisscross each other in a dialectical force field, where each actualizes the potentialities of the other, unquote. So for Benjamin, the destruction in modernity of the old models had not nullified the relevance of the past, but had rather released its imaginative energies. Harvesting these energies was also what was at stake in his own project. And I quote, "This work, the Arcade project, comparable in method to the process of splitting the atom, liberates the enormous energies of history that are bound up in the once upon a time of classical historiography. It is in that way modernist architecture used the past, and Le Corbusier himself was inspired by the Parthenon and medieval monasteries, not to create a mere neo-Gothic or neoclassical facade, but to freely and creatively recuperate them as imaginative models that help to give shape to a new type of man, fully engaged in the demands of modern society." Casa Malaparte perfectly illustrates Benjamin's point. Undeniable in modernist building, it is nevertheless deeply engaged with history. But instead of making his architectural creativity subservient to historical models, Malaparte did the opposite. The past he refers to is a realm of the modern imagination rather than historical reality. He deliberately ironizes, subverts the references to the past, turns a pyramid upside down, an amphitheater inside out, makes a boat out of a Roman villa, and a temple out of sheer sky. He uses these models only to freely tear them apart and harvest their imaginative forces, Benjamin's atomic energies of history. This conscious, ironic attitude towards the past stands in striking opposition to the illusions propagated by fascism. Obviously, for Malaparte, the idealized Roman antiquity dreamt up by Italian fascism could never be anything but a dream, a mirage, although as a mirage, it certainly appealed to him. And likewise, he must have been skeptical of the idea that fascism could really bring back a mythic age, a world of heroes outside the stream of time. This is made clear by one more poetical architectural choice he had made. Casa Malaparte is built from the limestone of Capri itself, a material that, because of its high percentage in salt, is sensitive to erosion. In blatant opposition to the fascist architecture that was built for eternity, Malapart destined his house, which he himself called melancholic, to bear the marks of the passing of time. In his book on Casa Malapart, MacDonald describes the house with a phrase of Breton as, and I quote, a powerful locomotive abandoned for years to the madness of the virgin forest. Given that Malapart indeed abandoned his masterpiece to the forces of time, this is a striking comparison indeed.
With Casa Malapart, its owner created a mythic place, a world that he knew had never existed and could never exist as such. But does that not make Casa Malapart's modernist house as escapist and bourgeois as the 19th century interiors described by Benjamin? Undeniably, Casa Malapart is a dream space as well. But Malapart himself is the first one to point this out, for example by the gesture of the chestnut frames around the windows. Don't believe what you see, Malapart seems to tell us. This utopia is a fiction. Remember, I designed the scenery. Finally, we should also bear in mind what gave Malapart the initial inspiration for the Capri House, the experience of imprisonment. He called Casa Malapart, and I quote, the ghost, the secret image of my jail, and he compared himself to a bird who had swallowed his cage. He called Casa Malapart the image of my nostalgia. And he even went as far as to put grids in front of the smaller windows, and it was his intention, unbelievable but true, to make grids for the picture windows too. Symbolized by these gridded windows, the idea of escape unmasks itself as an illusion. Malapart knew that we are always prisoners of the now, melancholically looking to the distant shores of past and future. They can never be anything but sceneries, perspectives. But, as Casa Malapart illustrates, what is a place, whether in space or in time, else but the sum of its perspectives? The present is inescapably where we live. The windows are barred, the cliff is steep, the boat is stranded, but the view is magnificent. Thank you for your attention.